let me dial this out and go to Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2 is so important in political ethics because Genesis 1 and 2 is not necessarily speaking the specific language of politics, but it's speaking architecturally about creation order itself. And when you look at Genesis 1 and 2, just a few things come to mind. You have the very notion of existence, identity, and family at the very forefront of Genesis 1 and 2. Existence, identity, and family. That to me is Scripture's way of communicating to us that you need to build political societies where existence, identity, and families are appreciated and strengthened. When we look at political options on display, on offer right now, we have political movements afoot that want to deny someone's right to life. We have movements that want to collapse identity into whatever you want it to mean, which is incredibly destabilizing, and human nature is not meant to bear the weight of those existential questions. To say nothing of the trans issue, but identity just writ large. And then third, active open assault on the centrality of the family.
Well, welcome aboard, men. Those of you who are logging on now as we are approaching here the top of the hour and getting ready for what will be a good conversation. Glad to have you with us today as we are going to talk about something I think all of us have to be ready for in the months ahead or in the year ahead for our Canadian friends. I know that 2024 is an election year for us, 2025 an election year for you, but it's already an issue for you in Canada, and what we're going to talk about today is going to be equally applicable to your situation as it's going to be to our current situation. We want to let you know again that there's going to be email coming out this week that will give you additional access to information, articles, resources, including resources that our guest, Dr. Andrew Walker, has produced that I think you will find helpful. So look for that in your email inbox before the week is out. We also want to let you know that Dr. Walker is going to begin our time with some thoughts for us, but there's time for Q&A at the end of this. You're welcome to begin populating your questions in the chat box here on Zoom at any point during Dr. Walker's message to us. Go ahead and start populating questions, and when he's done, we will begin the dialogue and have the opportunity to interact with him on these matters. One other housekeeping note, and that is that next month, we're going to be moving things up a week. We're going to be meeting on the first Wednesday of the month rather than the second Wednesday. A little bit of a schedule adjustment so that we can coordinate our schedule with Trevin Wax, who's going to be joining us. And we're going to be talking about multidimensional leadership, which is a concept that he's written about and that I have found very personally helpful. So I want you to just mark that date and note that it's going to be a week ahead of what we had originally scheduled for that time. So I think that takes care of the housekeeping notes. Let me introduce to you Dr. Andrew Walker, who is going to be with us today. He is a professor at Southern Seminary. He teaches ethics and public theology. He is an editor at the World News Group. He's a fellow at the EPPC, the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He's a husband. He's a dad. He is also curiously a Celtics fan, which he's going to have to explain to us Andrew, maybe before we get into what you're going to talk about, explain how this all came about.
Yeah, well, no, it came about because in the fall, my wife looked at me and she's like, you need more hobbies in your life because what I read as far as like news, politics, theology, that is my hobby. Like my hobby is what I get paid to do. And so it's all that I think about sometimes. And I just get like too caught up in it sometimes and fatigued and exhausted. And it looks like a lot of the guys on this call are somewhat in my age group. So you'll understand what I'm about to say. I grew up in Illinois in the Jordan era. And so Michael Jordan was just like everything in my life. But even while, a downstate Illinois kid, I always kind of had this thing for the Boston Celtics. I kind of like Larry Bird a little bit as well. And so it was in December. I was like, all right, I'm on some winter break. I'm going to follow the Celtics. I'm going to go all in. And so I have. And so I'm like following them every single game. And it's actually been awesome because I can like watch a game at night and I'm not scrolling or reading something. And it's just like actually an outlet for my mind to rest, which is really nice.
Well, downstate Illinois is as close to French Lick, Indiana as it is to Chicago. So there's some
Yeah, that's
geographic
right.
connection there. I just want to alert guys, if they're not following you on Twitter or X, as it's now called, I'd encourage them to do that. I learn a lot and appreciate your communication on that medium. And if they don't read what you post on World News Group on the opinion section, that's always very helpful as well. So we're thrilled to have you with us as we're going to talk about how we shepherd a congregation in the middle of what promises to be a very contentious political season where emotions are going to be heightened. This is something that you have written about, and we should point out that some of your Baptist colleagues have taken a shot at you. I just saw
Yeah.
on Twitter this morning that you posted a link to a negative review you got of your most recent monograph.
Yeah. In fact, I was going to use that as kind of one of my launching pads to jump in, if that's all right.
Well,
Yeah. So
jump in, take over.
yeah, and I'll just so you all know, I'm going to talk relatively briefly because of the volatility of the subject. I really do want to allow for as much time as possible to think through kind of how we can address this congregationally and relationally and the virtues that we need. But Bob raises a good thing, a good point. Last week, I published about a 14,000 word resource for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission called "The Nations Belong to God: A Christian Guide to Political Engagement," and I'm pretty confident they're going to send that to you all after this call is over. It's entirely free. It's in the form of a catechism, and so it's basically 40 questions related to Christians and politics. So question, answer, and then like 200, 300 words of commentary, building out the question that I've just answered. And like if you know the ERLC, like that's a pretty kind of like down the middle, like reasonable evangelical organization. So I wrote it for them, and basically just said standard Christian things. I mean, nothing remotely controversial. That marriage is the union of one man and one woman. That we define human beings by their immutable characteristics, such as biology. And a liberal Baptist group from Baptist News Global wrote this, like, it's got to be 2,000 or 3,000 words, accusing me of like being almost palatable, but fundamentally a dominionist and holding to Seven Mountain theology that's seeking to kind of overtake America. And I say all of that because the response to this article that I just wrote, kind of, or this book that I just wrote, encapsulates the stupid age that we're living in when it comes to politics. I wish I had a better adjective than stupid, but it's often just very stupid right now. And so what I think that means for all of you, and I'm gonna tailor my remarks here at the end about this, but as shepherds, I think it means keeping your wits about you, pursuing what the Bible refers to as sober-mindedness. And in fact, I'll just go there right now. One of the things I wanted to talk about that I think that we need to be doing in churches is reminding our congregations that political obsession is not the chief end of man. And I use that language very intentionally because we have the Westminster Catechism, which is the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And that's an ultimate reality. Politics is at best a secondary or penultimate reality. And as I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes, it's a heavily important thing for us to contend with and to think about and have well-developed thoughts about. But the age in which we live is it's frenetic, it's chaos, it's hyper fragility around the subject of politics. And so what I think we have to do as leaders within evangelicalism, leaders within the local church, is to rightly order those loves, right? To kind of talk about this in an Augustinian valence, is to understand that politics is important, but politics is not ultimate. And so therefore, it's not deserving of the degree of love that the world would want to ascribe to politics. There's a great quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it from the theologian Oliver O'Donovan. He said, in times of great political frenzy and political chaos, which obviously since 2020, that has been what has defined the moment that we're living in those times of frenzy, maybe one of the most important things we can do as believers is ironically not talk about politics as much. And I think the reason I say that is, if you're like me, there's public commentary that goes on talking about white evangelicalism, about what that means and does not mean. And so problematically, in terms of journalism, in terms of political science demographics, evangelicalism has become now a political taxonomy more than it is associated with a biblical category. And I've actually, if you're interested in this, I've done a lot of work kind of critiquing the idea of this being a political category. And I did one of those TGC good faith debates with a political scientist on this subject and the problems of that. But the reality is, there are thousands and thousands of pastors laboring in anonymity who are not waking up every single day thinking about politics. They're preaching the word, they're visiting the sick, they're praying with those in their churches, they're counseling those individuals. But because of how much oxygen politics sucks up in this age, politics can begin to make its way into the church. And please hear me, I do not want you to walk away from our time together thinking that I'm devaluing politics. I have tremendous value for politics. And on the spectrum of too engaged from not engaged at all, I know that I fall on the spectrum of too much engagement, that I care too much about politics. So there's some self-awareness we have to have in this discussion. But I say all of that because we need to be able to know where we fit on that spectrum and to guide our people into a way, I think, of lowering the temperature, de-escalating things a little bit. I know on this call, if I surveyed how many of us have had relationships recalibrated because of political fallout, I bet every single person could raise their hand. Which means, in some sense, that may be necessary at certain points, because I want to hold out certain narrow exceptions. Generally, that shouldn't be how we shape our life as Christians. We're living in this unique moment right now where what I call there's TDS in both directions. Trump devotion syndrome has broken people, and then Trump derangement syndrome has broken people. And there are people who need Trump to win so that they can maintain their relevance. And there are people that hate Trump, but yet still need him to win in order to maintain their relevance. And my appeal for all of us is for that not to be any of us on this call. Not that we are above the fray when it comes to politics at large, but that we have a degree of sober-mindedness, reasonableness, of not pure reactivity when it comes to how we're thinking about politics. Now, what I'll say here is this, and I want to thinking more about what politics is and why it matters for us to have this conversation within, is politics does matter, as I've just been sharing with you all. I'm an ethics professor. I've written books on some very controversial subjects, and so a part of my job is just fielding questions from people. And it never fails me, in any setting that I'm in, I get the question from, the good, God-fearing, Bible-believing Christian. They raise their hand and they say, how do we make things better? How do we fix the things that have gone wrong? Assuming that I have this kind of Willy Wonka golden ticket to fix the situation. And I don't have this, I don't have that golden ticket. If I did, we wouldn't have the problems that we do. But my response to all of these individuals and my response to all of you is that everyone can do something to help kind of rectify some of the total social chaos going on in our society today. Everyone has some small part to play. But fundamentally, what that means is there's going to have to be some degree of political attentiveness. You're going to have to pay attention to what's happening in your local communities. The problem for today is that because of the nationalization of media, we automatically federalize all of our politics. So we view politics through the lens only of Trump v. Biden, or Senate immigration bills versus House funding of the border wall, when in reality, most of us in here may not be able to identify who our state representative is or who our state senator is. And the reality is, as we're thinking about politics, before it's a top level conversation, politics is a local conversation first. And it's to our great neglect that we've federalized our discussion around politics around this kind of 30,000 foot ethereal discussion that really no one can really affect change on their own, because none of us in here can affect federal policy on our own. What each of us can do is you can be aware of who's running for school board. You can be aware of who's running for alderman in your community. You can be aware of who your state representative is. I wrote an article on this, and Bob, maybe you'll want to share this later. It was called Voting After Dobbs. So like, it was the ethics of voting in light of Roe falling. And one of the arguments I made was voting responsibility actually heightens, in a sense, after Roe fell, because now the abortion issue falls to a 50 state by state basis, meaning that it's no longer just federal. You have to pay attention to state issues. And here in Kentucky, it's not even just a state level issue. It's a city level issue, because our Democratic mayor wants to declare Louisville basically kind of an abortion sanctuary city. So all of a sudden, political issues take on a much more local significance. And I say all of this because we can be blue in the face and frustrated and angry at the condition of our society. And there are lots of ways to have conversations about changing society. We need better art, right? We need people with godly business practices. But a lot of that does boil down to granular tactical questions of who is running for office. Because guess what? Every single person who's running for office has a conscience. That conscience is being shaped in one direction or the other, in a direction of godliness or in a direction of ungodliness. And so politics is not abstract. Politics is deeply personal. It's deeply personal because every single person has a conscience, and people with consciences are going to be making decisions on what policy looks like. Now, other reasons I think politics matters in the aggregate for us to think about is, what is politics? Let's ask that question. That's a meta level question. Politics is basically the art of how we organize ourselves in society under legal authorities for, and this is the kicker, for the sake of the common good. Meaning that politics is not about self-interest. It's not about just protecting the rights and privileges of Christians. It's really not. Our rights are bound up with everyone else's rights, meaning that when we're thinking about why we engage in politics, we engage in politics and think about politics because we want to create societies where every single person is treated equally under the law and is given equal opportunity to flourish under the law. And so societies, we don't want governments that are too overbearing in our lives and are trying to make everyone prosper by manipulating the dials of society too much, because then you have kind of an authoritarian, that's too much government. In my understanding of the Bible's kind of blueprint for the purpose of government, government's role is pretty limited. And I don't mean that in a conservative kind of Rush Limbaugh talking point type way. Government is not assigned in Scripture very many roles in society. It's there to praise that which is good, punish that which is evil. It's to restrain the evildoer It's to establish systems of justice so that everyone can prosper. And so, everyone loves justice, right? Everyone wants to think about loving our neighbor. Okay, well, guess what? Politics is just one way of how to love our neighbor in the aggregate, because what we're saying with politics is let's build the type of society based on particular laws where everyone is able to prosper and flourish in seeking the common good. And that common good, that's a famous phrase in political theology. Common good is basically the idea that societies are set up to where the various pillars of society, individuals, families, businesses, nonprofits, are able, voluntary associations, are able to prosper in accordance with how all of these various constitutive parts of society are meant to flourish, which means that requires active engagement and attentiveness with politics. And of course, and I'll begin to kind of wind up here so we can turn towards some discussion. We're living in a time period where I think evangelicalism is defined by either too much politics or too little politics. It's really, the temptations are domination or withdrawal, authoritarianism or retreat. And I think everyone on here needs to evaluate and self-assess, where are you on that spectrum? Do you love politics too much? That's me. So I know that I've got to kind of dial back sometimes and not allow my frustrations with society to affect my spiritual life. When I began viewing Nancy Pelosi as scum of the earth, I might have tremendous policy differences with Nancy Pelosi, and I most certainly do. But the doctrine of the image of God means she's deserving of a degree of respect that I am called to give her, even when my flesh may not want to give that to her. So again, this is the question of rightly ordering our loves. But I'll also say this with regard to the retreat temptation. I hear sometimes a lot of Bible-believing Christians who will say what I call kind of precious moments theology. Remember the precious moments figurines from old days? These kind of like really pious spirituality claims that really mean nothing. Phrases like, we don't worship an elephant or a donkey, we worship the lamb. Okay, that sounds cool. It sounds neat. That's a really vacuous and empty phrase that solves nothing. Because at the end of the day, real lives are on the stake, are at stake when it comes to politics. And I will hear some Christians use phrases like this: we Christians shouldn't be concerned about our rights. Christ relinquished his rights, so we shouldn't be caught up with our rights. Now, to give the benefit of the doubt, on one level, I can understand to a degree why that concern is present. If politics for Christians is seeking the privilege of Christians over other people in the community, that is a problem. And I think that's actually unbiblical because of what politics is. Politics is not meant to benefit Christians especially. Politics is meant to benefit all equally. But if we find ourselves using the language of why do we care about our rights, it's because in the system that we've set up in a Western context, it's that everyone's rights are all bound up with everyone else's rights. So the moment that I don't care about my rights, it means I'm not caring about the rights of others. And that has repercussions and ripple effects that can have some problematic consequences down the line. Last thing I'll say, and then we'll turn to you all, is I teach at the seminary here. And it's astonishing to me to see the diversity globally of the students that we get in the classroom at Southern Seminary. And we have a large population of students from China. And I remember I was getting to know one of the students in my shepherding group, Martin. And Martin was a pastor at an underground church in China. And I said to Martin, I said, Martin, would you all as Chinese Christians enjoy having a right to religious liberty? And he gave me this like blank look, like, why would you ask such a stupid question? His response was, yes, absolutely, we want rights. No pastor is actively seeking out going underground. We don't enjoy having to meet in our homes only so that we're not tracked by the government. Of course, we would love to walk and talk freely about our faith in our society, but we can't. And that was one of those kind of eye-opening experiences where I think a lot of well-meaning Christians can mouth these truisms about throw away your rights, throw away politics, let's go into the catacombs because that's where true righteousness is found. And I just don't think that bears out. Political conditions can affect ministry contexts. And I really will shut up after I say this. We often hear the phrase, I think it's Tertullian who said this, or Origen, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Y'all have heard that phrase probably. That's not canonical. It's not necessarily biblical either. That's one of those phrases that we've kind of adopted as a non-inspired part of the Christian canon, so to speak. And there's a sense in which that's true, that martyrdom is a profound witness that can embolden the faith of others. But the other side of that is, no, political regimes can be very, very successful at stamping out Christian witness. And if you want an example of that, look at what Japan did to Christian missionaries in the 19th centuries, to the point today where there is a very, very, very marginal Christian witness in a place like Japan because of what the government did. So that means politics matters. Politics isn't everything. That's my temptation. But politics isn't nothing either. So let's stop right there, and I'll turn this over to you all.
So I've got a ton of questions, but I don't want to dominate. Those of you who have got questions, put them in the chat box. We've also included a link to the article, Voting After Dobbs, that's in the chat box. Let me just start off with this. In our congregation, if somebody pulled into our parking lot on a Sunday morning with a Biden bumper sticker, or for our Canadian friends, a Trudeau bumper sticker on the back of their car, there would be some in our congregation, maybe some in our leadership, who would say, this person needs to be confronted, needs to be discipled, may need to be disciplined. Are they right?
So I got to answer that at various levels, and I want to be brief in saying this. Political labels can change from one generation to the next. I'm actually, just to be candid, I'm very concerned about the Republican Party taking on the language of safe, legal, and rare in its own terminology here because of what's been happening politically. Mm-hmm. But I would say this, and intellectual honesty just demands that I be true to myself and true to you all, to what I think with my conscience. When you compare the party platforms, they are asymmetrical in the moral values of the platforms. And the reason I say that is not because I am beholden to the Republican Party. If the Republican Party goes down the wrong path, I will blast them as much as anyone else. But here, let me dial this out and go to Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2 is so important in political ethics because Genesis 1 and 2 is not necessarily speaking the specific language of politics, but it's speaking architecturally about creation order itself. And when you look at Genesis 1 and 2, just a few things come to mind. You have the very notion of existence, identity, and family at the very forefront of Genesis 1 and 2. Existence, identity, and family. That to me is Scripture's way of communicating to us that you need to build political societies where existence, identity, and families are appreciated and strengthened. When we look at political options on display, on offer right now, we have political movements afoot that want to deny someone's right to life. We have movements that want to collapse identity into whatever you want it to mean, which is incredibly destabilizing, and human nature is not meant to bear the weight of those existential questions. To say nothing of the trans issue, but identity just writ large. And then third, active open assault on the centrality of the family. In our current day and age, in our current nomenclature, the problems there fall more on the side of a progressive platform. But when you're talking about does someone need to be confronted, I think it would be incredibly awkward to go up to someone and say, hey, I saw you get out of your car with the Biden bumper sticker. Tell me more. That's pretty weird, right? Like that's needlessly confrontational. You know, I take the approach of people can sin in ignorance. They can really not know the depths of what they may be committed to. I'll just give this to you in my context. If I had someone in my context who was having the Biden bumper sticker, and they said, well, hey, you know, I'm a public school teacher. I believe in the necessity of public schools. That's why I'm voting for Democrats. I have a category for that. I disagree with that mentality from some ethical standpoints that I don't have time to discuss. But my evaluation is a little less intense. If someone says to me, hey, no, I'm fervently pro-abortion. To me, my response is, oh, well, I don't really care about your politics.
Right.
I care about, you say that you are confessing Christ as your Lord and Savior. And I think that that is incompatible with the declaration that Christ is Lord. Christ is called the author of life. You're okay with political platforms that want to fundamentally attack and deny and make possible the elimination of life, innocent life. That's unjust. Ethically, we call that murder. I think, Bob, to maybe tighten this up, it requires more conversation.
Right.
But I will say, if I have someone who says I'm fervently pro-choice in my congregation, that's a problem.
There's a discipleship conversation needs to happen there. And
Absolutely.
this gets into the question of how we represent biblical morality and biblical ethics without sounding partisan, because it's hard not to.
Well, and so let me say something there right now. The problem today is that we want to keep politics and religion separate. That's great if they're truly kept separate. So many of the issues that have entered the public domain come to us disguised as politics, but they're actually deeply, deeply religious issues. And so, to perfect example here, just because I affirm the doctrine of natural law from Scripture, and I say that society must align itself with God's understanding of the natural law, all of a sudden, and this stupid review that that was criticizing me, like they called me a dominionist and a theocrat, all because I affirm basic biblical morality. Mm-hmm. And here's just a good lesson for all of us. I want y'all to hear. It doesn't matter how much you run from the labels of conservative and Democrat, Republican, or liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat. You can run from those terms all you want. If you affirm biblical morality in terms of the natural law and the necessity of law to respond and align with the natural law of God, you are going to get categorized as a Christian nationalist by all of the chattering classes on Twitter and in the media. So you just got to sign up for that if you're going to hold the Bible.
Andrew, have you had a chance to look at, is it the After Party? Is that what it's called? The discipleship program that has come out? You have any thoughts about that?
I have not viewed the content myself, so I need to reserve full criticism. But I would have tremendous concern. It's very publicly known the funding behind the After Party at this point. I have tremendous concern about expressly progressive organizations, pro-abortion, pro-sexual revolution, funding a curriculum intended to get in front of evangelical audiences. So I have a partial criticism. I haven't seen the full thing myself, but I've worked in nonprofit sectors. I've worked for think tanks. I know how this works. You take money from some other organization. You may not mention all of the things they want you to mention, but you're definitely not going to use their money to contravene or contradict their mission.
Yeah. As a pastor, I have people in my congregation who are concerned that I am compromising if I am not being more public and using the pulpit to speak out on the issues of the day, culture war issues, and especially in a political season. I have other folks who, if I start doing that, are going to start going somewhere else to church. I'm going to lose some members one way or another this season. So what should I, between now and November, should I keep my mouth shut on Sunday morning about matters of politics, or should I look for a text that I can jump on to help influence my people in the right direction?
Yeah, so many good questions right there. First and foremost, if you're a pastor right now in 2024, I think you've got to find some text in the course of the year to talk about biblical principles for citizenship. 1 Timothy 2, 1 Peter 2, Romans 13. Let the text of Scripture guide you. Don't come in with your own hot takes. Let Scripture provide the foundation for where you're going to go with your congregation. But I do think this is the season to talk about some type of political engagement, godly discipleship. And by the way, the resource that I wrote for the ERLC, it's free for churches. It's meant for pastors. It's meant for lay people in the pews. It's written for that level. It was written to be downloaded and distributed to as many churches want it. What I would also say, though, is to take away some heartburn. I think it could be good to address from the pulpit under what conditions you will talk about something and under what conditions you won't. There's an article, and I address this in the political engagement guide that I just wrote. There's a really good article that I want to point you all towards. And Bob, if you can search this, or someone can search this, it's called "Why Carl Henry Was Right." It was written at Christianity Today in 2010. Someone can find that and drop it in. I'm not sure if it's behind a paywall or not. That is the best article I've ever read. It's written by Rich Mao, talking about Carl Henry and how in the 1970s, some people wanted CT to weigh in on things directly political. And Carl Henry said, no, we cannot weigh in on every political issue because, and he used the three categories, the church doesn't have the mandate, the jurisdiction, or the competency to address every issue under the sun. Yeah. You all should not be talking about consumption taxes versus income taxes. I don't think that's your responsibility. When you're talking in the field guide that I just wrote, I talk about when a political issue hits on first tier creation order issues, life, marriage, religious liberty. I think that's where you have license to go in to the pulpit and say, this is what we believe on this issue. Not because I'm taking my marching orders from the GOP, but because we believe in the Bible, and the Bible posits these principles for us to live by. So please read that article. It's fantastic. Henry, I forget if he says it there. Yeah, I think it's in that article. He goes on to state that the job of the church is to declare the criteria upon which man will be judged and the standards by which society must conform itself to if society is to endure. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a great benchmark to kind of set those guardrails for what you're going to speak to.
The link to the article is in the chat box, so folks can check it out there. Last call for questions in that chat box as well. You need to populate those if we want to get to your questions. And let me ask you this. When 20 plus years ago, I was working for a nonprofit, Family Life, doing marriage and family work. And out in California, Prop 8 was going to be on the ballot. And Prop 8 was defining marriage and family around a biblical view, one man, one woman for a lifetime. And people came to us at Family Life and said, will you endorse Prop 8? And we said, well, we certainly endorse the biblical view that marriage is between one man and one woman for a lifetime. And yes, we will endorse that. And they said, good, so you'll endorse Prop 8. And we said, well, no, we'll endorse the biblical view. In other words, we kept some arm's distance between supporting the public policy effort, but while we supported the biblical ethic. Were we just being cowardly, or is that the appropriate way for us to handle public policy interaction?
I reserve the right to be wrong here. If that were me, I probably would have said, yeah, this church supports Proposition 8. Whether that means the church's name is going to get put on some placard, I think there's some wisdom issues there. I wouldn't, as a general principle that I live by, I wouldn't run from the label that the political progressive is going to attach to you regardless of what you do. It's one of those things where, like, you're not going to be able to escape the limelight if you believe that marriage is the union of one man and one woman. Again, there's a wisdom issue about, does your name go on the placard? I don't know. But I would have said, as a pastor, hey, this church, as your pastor, we are preaching in favor of Proposition 8 because of what it teaches is true about the Bible.
And I think we have to give up on the idea that as long as we remain kind and winsome, our enemies will gravitate in our direction.
Guys, there's been I really want to stress this. Evangelical politics, circa 2000 through 2015, kind of trafficked upon like the possibility of winsome. And what I mean by this is, if we are winsome, we'll be able to retain our biblical conviction and retain our social standing as well. I don't think that's the case. Again, that's not a permission to be outrageous and unreasonable whatsoever. But if you affirm basic principles of Christian orthodoxy in the public square today, you're going to get labeled certain things. And I just remember, let's keep this focused on Jesus. There was no one more compassionate or truthful or gracious than Jesus Christ himself. And he still got put on a cross by political powers. And so, again, I'm not saying be ridiculous on social media and being a jerk from the pulpit. But at some certain point, you just have to recognize you can bend over backwards to placate, nuance, and at the end of the day, you're just going to be a really nice and civil bigot to some people, not all. And I think that depends squarely on the nature of the conversation partner. I've gotten to know someone in Louisville in the last month, super, super progressive on the total opposite side of things as me. We disagree on everything, but he's actually like an old school liberal who believes in freedom of speech and is open to having good conversation and debate. He doesn't call me a bigot. He thinks I'm really, really wrong. I think he's really, really wrong. If more liberals were like that guy, we'd be in a much different place.
Right.
But that guy is not the norm of where most progressives are any longer.
All right, let me read this question to you. It says, 50 years ago, civil religion, which I think of as largely positive, provided a degree of civility. This is what we're talking about, and shared moral vocabulary. How do you engage in the public square without a shared moral vocabulary and contrary visions of the good? Should we put those political energies into formation and rebuild the shared vision? Or should we, is civility sufficient that without a shared vision of the good, it's a zero-sum game?
Yeah, great question. So, actually, I would really commend, there's an example, if someone wants to find this, Tim Keller gave an amazing address before the British Parliament. This was 5 or 6 years ago, I think. And, he's obviously speaking, I think he was speaking, it might have been the conservatives, or it might have been some Christians in British Parliament, but I know that it was also a pretty secular audience as well. And what he did was genius, and it's not that genius in retrospect, but what he did was to try to find a common ground of shared concern. And so like he took the issue of human rights. You speak the language of human rights, the secular progressive loves the language of human rights. And he proceeded to talk about how, well, actually, human rights came about because of Christianity. And here's why. There's this super fascinating thing happening with some prominent intellectuals happening right now. It's what I'm calling them red-pilled ex-liberals. They're not Christians, but there's like this growing strand of intellectual, Douglas Murray, Ali Hersey Ali, Louise Perry, Mary Harrington, who else? Tom Holland. All of these individuals are non-Christians, but they're all saying we can't have decency or human rights or justice without the Christian tradition behind it. And I think that might be the formula that we need. And this will blow your mind. I have this anecdote coming out in my book that's coming out in May. But Tom Holland, who's not a Christian, got asked in a public forum, what should be the place of Christianity in a secularizing society? And he answered by saying, well, at the end of the day, human rights are just a belief. They're just as much a belief as a belief in angels, which he's totally right about. And he goes on to say, if I'm a Christian, I'm going to say, well, it's actually Christianity that birthed this doctrine of human rights. If you like human rights that Christianity gave you, and that requires assent to faithful propositions, then why not believe the resurrection as well? And I was like, what did he just do? That sounded like a reverse Paul on the Areopagus, and he's a non-Christian, but he just made the connection between human rights being a faith proposition. Christianity gave it. Okay, well, then just draw the connection. Why not believe the resurrection as well? It was absolutely brilliant. And the fact that a non-Christian made that is shocking.
The Keller video we've got a link to in the chat box, so guys can watch
y'all
that
watch
as well.
That. It's terrific. Or the argument that Tom Holland is making in his book Dominion. Notions of like political mercy and political forgiveness, human dignity. Also, find the article by Louise Perry called "We Are Repaganizing from First Things." It was October 23. Unbelievable essay.
How about the AND campaign? Thoughts about it?
I have great respect for Justin Giboney as a man. He and I have shared some stages together before. I appreciate he will with integrity call out the left and so I appreciate that. Respectfully, if he were here, I would want him to hear this with love and critique when I say it. I disagree with some of his understandings of what is possible in the political moment that we're in. I feel like the AND campaign generally draws too much moral equivalence between the parties. And please hear me, that's not a blanket endorsement of one party. Again, the labels can change, the nomenclature can adapt over time. But I think that there is too much moral equivocation coming from the AND campaign, despite my respect for Justin Giboney.
Can you speak to the rise of postmillennialism and theonomy in the church at large and how we need to address that in this political season?
Oh, gosh.
And do it in about 2 minutes, please.
I'm sorry to just give resources, but it's hopefully beneficial for you afterwards. I wrote a review at 9 Marks on Stephen Wolf's The Case for Christian Nationalism. Although he's not really post-millennial, he's not actually technically a theonomist. These labels mean a lot of things.
Right.
I also wrote an article that I'd point you all towards called "What Does Christian Nationalism Even Mean?" that I wrote at World Opinions. Listen, I'm a Baptist. I think the state or the government is a poor disciple and an even worse pastor. And while we should be preaching to change the world, as I understand it, as a Baptist, culture change happens through conscience change. Conscience change happens through the preached word in the local congregation. My concern with Reconstruction and theonomy is that it begins making political conquest a mission of the church proper. And I think that political engagement is a byproduct of the gospel. So in some sense, we might want it to end at the same destination, but we get there differently. And I think once you start making political conquest a function of the church proper, I think you begin running into some mission drift potentially, and such that churches themselves basically become synonymous with that brand of Christian politics. And I'll also say this, one of the things that concerns me with the theonomy postmillennial discussion, it's what I call strongman theology. It's like alpha male theology. It's like I'm an alpha male, I'm a strong man, I'm by nature a dominating figure. I want a theology that fits my psychological profile and personality. Therefore, I'm going to adopt that political theology. I think a biblical political theology should challenge our natural predilections, our natural inclinations. If you have a political theology that basically baptizes all of your inclinations, I don't think that you have a biblical political ethic at that point.
I mentioned at the beginning of our time that we're going to be sending out an email this week that will have links to resources, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and trust that Zach and Olivia and the team are going to include links that we've talked about here as a part of the email that we will send out to folks this week. So guys, it's in the chat box. You can copy and paste from there, but we'll try to get these links to you as well. I want to wrap up, Andrew, and just I have come back over and over again to 2 Timothy 2 and to these words to help guide me in the midst of some of this. And I'd just like you to respond to this. The Bible says the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth. They may come to their senses and escape the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. And as I think about cultural and political engagement and my pastoral role, those are the guiding marks for me. I must not be quarrelsome. I must be kind to everyone. I must patiently endure evil. I read that one and go, can I scratch that one out of my Bible, please? You know, who wants that? But it seems to me that if my civil discourse and my political engagement and my interaction with people in my congregation, if the fruit of the Spirit is not present in the midst of that discourse, then it is not, God is not pleased with how that discourse is going. Am I right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Fruits of the Spirit are paramount. I mentioned at the very beginning how important virtue is in this discussion. Virtue in the form of intellectual honesty. Will you call fouls on both sides? Charitableness. Are you able to meaningfully engage with people? Disagreeableness. Are you able to disagree? I think right now the crying, and I say this not as a pastor, so y'all can rebuke me for saying this. I think the crying need of the hour for pastoral ministry right now is resilience and anti-fragility. One of the most important things as I'm talking with pastors. Bob, I guess the last thing I'll say in response to that is my knee-jerk view of the topography in evangelicalism right now is that we have some really, 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 really loud figures that can occupy a lot of the oxygen. But those really, really loud figures are not that numerical as far as number, which means I think the critical mass of the broad swath of evangelicalism probably needs to speak up a little bit more. But I think that they're afraid to speak up because they don't want to be associated with the loudest voices that are happening over there. But I think that what was the first part of the verse?
The Lord's
not
servant must
quarrel.
not be quarrelsome, but must be, I'll pull it up, must not be quarrelsome, kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently
Yeah,
enduring evil. It's the able
yeah,
to teach that we've got to be, right?
able to teach. And so here's what I would encourage all of you. A friend of mine made this observation. I think it's very astute. Where are the areas that when they surface to talk about, you wince or you have a negative reflex, like, oh gosh, like, oh, I had someone tell me, oh gosh, I've got to preach First Timothy 2 this Sunday. Like they were embarrassed about it. um don't let that be you. And I would say, like, is there a political issue that if it were to surface, you just think, I don't want to touch that? And I'm not saying you have to touch it. Okay. I'm not saying you have to touch it. I think you want to ask, why am I having the instinct to not want to touch that? Because that's where the teaching of truth comes in. And I do think, generally speaking, and even in conservative evangelicalism, there's still a reticence to speak up for fear of becoming the political church or putting yourself outside the margins of what is considered kind of mainstream evangelicalism. And I think that evangelicalism has more or less been conditioned. The broad swath of most of evangelicalism has been conditioned into political silence.
Well, but we're also concerned that we don't want to be written off by those we're trying to reach.
Oh, absolutely.
And
Yeah,
so
no, totally.
trying to find that narrow path where we are able
Yeah.
to teach without triggering and being
Yes.
dismissed completely, right?
No, totally. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
This has been really helpful. Thank you for the time. I'll let guys know we have recorded this and we're going to make it available after this conversation for those who weren't able to join us live. You may have friends, pastors, people who are not a part of GCC in your community that you'll want to point them to this so that they can watch this conversation and hear from Andrew as well. I'd encourage you to do that. And I'll reiterate again, next month, we're on the first Tuesday. We're on March 6th, or excuse me, first Wednesday, March 6th. We'll be talking with Trevin Wax about multidimensional leadership, and it's going to dovetail in with what we've been talking about here. So I hope you'll join us for that and find that helpful. Andrew, thank you. And men, all of you who have joined us, thank you for this time as well. Hope you've found it profitable, and we'll see you in a few weeks on Tuesday, or Wednesday. I don't know why I keep calling it Tuesday. Wednesday, March 6th. It's Wednesday, March 6th. We'll see you then.
Thank you all.